Hi, Michelle. How are you?
How are you?
Sorry. I was just
That's okay.
my name, Michelle. Let's see if I can find a better lit place. Oh, great. I think this will be better.
Looks great.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Let me turn up the volume on my speakers. Yes. Can you speak again?
Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Just.
Awesome.
Hi.
Oops, I think we got you big. Okay. I don't know why it's doing that. Well, we'll just leave it like that. All right, guys, so we're going to hear a little bit about Mamta and what she does, and then at the end, if it's okay, we'll probably have a few questions for you as well.
Yeah, and I was planning on leaving a lot of time for questions, so.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's all you.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. So first, I'll just tell you a little bit about myself, kind of how I got interested in science and space, and then a little bit about what I do. And then really, I'll open it up to whatever questions you have, whether it's about space or me or what I've done. It's totally open for you. So my name is Mamta, as you just heard, and I got into space as a young girl. I was probably about your age. And I had an older sister. She's about 4 years older than I am. And so she was coming home from school with science projects and science ideas that I had never heard of because I was so little. But she would come home and she'd say, Mamta, come here and look at this. And so she really got me interested in that way. And I started doing these experiments with her. And these were simple things like we would go outside and get leaves from the trees, and then we'd look them up and dry them and see what plants they came from and what their species were and their genus. And these were just things that got me interested in science. And every time I asked a question, my sister would encourage me to go and find the answer. So if I said, why do trees have leaves? Then we would go out and look at the leaves and try to figure out why trees have leaves. And so that's kind of how I got into it. I had a sister who influenced me in that way. And she wanted to be an astronaut, and I copied her, of course, being the little sister that I was. So anyone who's a little sister or a little brother, you would understand that. Or if you have a little sister or a little brother, we often want to copy our older siblings. And so that was really how I got into it. And I said I wanted to be an astronaut. Now, the difference was she grew out of it, but I became even more interested in it. And I wanted to learn about space. I was so fascinated by telescopes and looking out in the sky and what looked like a star but was actually a planet. And these things were just so interesting to me. So if you haven't ever looked through a telescope, I hope that you will find one. I went to the local university in my small town, and they had a telescope because we couldn't afford to have a telescope at home. So we went to the university, and I looked through that telescope, and I saw Saturn and actually saw the rings around Saturn. And that was one of the most defining moments as a young girl for me. So in any case, I went to college, I majored in engineering, and then I got a job at NASA as a student. So that's one thing I hope you'll remember as you get older, that you don't have to wait until you are 25 or 30 years old to get a job at these cool places. You can do it as a student, as young as high school. Sometimes you can even do programs in middle school, so 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade. But when I was in college, I got a job at NASA as a student, and that eventually led me to get a full-time. So since then, I've done a whole lot of different things. I'll just tell you briefly what I've done, and then you're welcome to ask questions. I've trained the astronauts. That means that I become an expert in something, like the International Space Station, and one small part of it. And then I teach the astronauts just what they need to know so they can go up into space and operate safely and be able to live in space with the knowledge that they need. I've worked how many of you have heard of mission control? Yay, good, yes. So mission control is in Houston, as you know, and I worked there. So I was actually one of those people you see sitting at the desk. And what we're doing there is looking at all of the data that's coming from space. And if anything goes red, then we know we need to pay attention. That means something is going wrong. If it's all green, then we're good to go, and it's a boring day in mission control. And we often like our boring days because that means nobody's in danger in space. But it is exciting when something goes red, and we have to be able to fix it. So an engineer working at NASA has to not only be able to fix something in front of us, but if it's broken in space, we have to fix it also. And our astronauts do help us because they're right there with the boxes in space. Let's see, I've designed trips to the moon. So I've actually created paths to get from Earth to the moon. I've operated a mission that was looking at the moon's very, very thin an exosphere, and we were studying that. I've done all sorts of things, and now what I get to do is communicate all of these things that we do in science to the general public. So put it in a way that hopefully is interesting to you and your parents and your friends and your neighbors. So that gives you just a small idea of what I've done, and I think what will be even more interesting for you is to be able to ask questions. So I would love to hear what questions you might have.
Have you ever gone to space?
Oh gosh, I really want to go to space. I did get an astronaut interview, which is very rare. It's very difficult to get one of those. In 2013, which was the last selection. I didn't make it all the way through, so I'll have to try again. But gosh, I hope someday I do get to go up into space.
Have you ever seen pictures of space, like up close?
Yes. So we have lots of pictures, and even you can see them from space. And the Hubble's telescope right now is the one that's giving us the most amazing images and has been doing so for 25 years of space, of stars, of the birth of stars. And yes, I've seen those, but really the best way to see space with your own eyes is through a telescope.
We're actually going to be doing that this afternoon.
Yeah.
Yeah. Flori, what's your question?
Have you ever seen a rocket?
I've seen lots of rockets, and they are huge in person. They look so small, like a toy rocket on the TV, but when you're in front of it in person, it is monstrous. It's so big.
Arabella.
Oh yeah, have you seen like a rocket blast off of America?
Yeah. So have you actually seen a rocket blast off with all the fire and stuff?
I have. So I've seen the space shuttle a number of times. I was very lucky. I saw one when I was 19 years old. I was on the way to an internship in Florida, and it just happened to be launching. So I saw one then, and then I went back a couple times as a student when I was working at NASA as well. And then I went back and saw the very last one. And then while I was living in Florida, because I was so close, I could see these other rocket launches that you don't often hear about in the news because people aren't on them, but they're taking up very important things. So for instance, how many of your moms and dads have cell phones? I bet all of us do, right? So those satellites that let our parents use the cell phones or the TV that you watch at home, all of that is because we've sent satellites up into space to allow this communication. And they go up on these rockets that don't have humans on board, but they have satellites on board. And so I've seen a lot of those rocket launches too. Hopefully you'll get to also.
Let's see, Maya. Okay, if you remember, raise your hand. Annalise.
Are there beds in the rocket ship?
Are there beds in the rocket ships when the astronauts go up into space?
That's a really, really good question. So, in space, it's kind of weird. They do have places to sleep, but they're not beds like you and I would think of. They're not the kinds of beds where you lie down horizontally to go to sleep. So in space, it's really weird. When a human goes up into space, and this is what I studied when I did my PhD, my doctorate in graduate school before I went back to work at NASA full time. So when we go up into space, when humans go up, we know that there's some change that happens in what's called the neurovestibular system, and that's the system that allows you to be able to keep your balance when you're walking. And it's caused by sensors. It's regulated by sensors in your ears. So when we go into space, we know that the neurovestibular system is put off balance. So this causes the astronauts to get a little sick. They get over it. They'll usually throw up their first couple times. And when they come back to Earth, they're a little off balance. But it also causes them to not know up from down. So when you put your hand up in the air, you know in your head that your hand is up in the air. But when an astronaut raises his or her hand up in the air in space, there is no up because you don't have the feeling of gravity. So there is no down. right? So in Earth, we know down is down because gravity pulls. If you throw up a ball, then gravity's going to pull it down. So we have a frame of reference for up and down. But in space, they have no reference for up and down. So can you believe this? Astronauts in a bed, but they're usually sleeping straight up. So when we see them, they look like they're sleeping standing up, but to them, they have no idea. So they usually strap themselves in so they don't go floating around. They'll put straps in, and they'll go into one corner of the space station or the space rocket, and that's where they'll sleep. We call them their sleeping quarters.
If you go to Mars, would it squish you like a tin can?
Would it squish you like a tin can?
Yes.
That is such a great question. So probably, if you go to Mars, you probably would feel the same as if you were going into space for a shorter trip. So the rocket would, it might be larger, but it may also not be larger. The larger you make a rocket, the more that it costs to send up into space because it weighs more. And that's what costs so much to get into space. You have to have more fuel the more heavy that your rocket is. So they would optimize the size of it so that, let's say 7 people are going to go, that 7 people could live in comfortably. But comfortably is relative. You and I would need more space because we're not used to being in a tin can. But these astronauts are. All of the rocket ships are so small because, again, it costs less money if we can make them smaller. So you would probably be in a tin can sized spaceship, but you wouldn't get squished.
Has the astronauts that went up in space ever studied?
Okay. Have the astronauts that have been up in space, have they studied the new planet yet?
Oh, so that's funny. The astronauts don't actually get, when they're out in space, they're not close enough to be able to study the planets. The planets are so far away. That has to be done by scientists on the ground. And those scientists are called astrophysicists or astronomers. So astrophysicists and astronomers, both, they're awfully similar fields, will be the ones who are looking through the telescope or operating the satellite. And in this case, the new planet you're thinking of was discovered by Kepler, which is a mission that came out of NASA Ames in California, and they manage that mission. So they're getting all the data in their own mission control center, and those engineers are watching all of that data, and the scientists are getting all of the data and processing it. So they get a bunch of numbers. They're zeros and ones and things that to you and me would look like garbage, but these scientists can change it from those zeros and ones and those numbers into real data that helps us learn about the planet. So in this case, the astronauts wouldn't study the new planet, but the astrophysicists and the astronomers here on Earth are studying it.
Okay. Have any of the astronauts who've gone into space, have they seen any aliens or something, some other life form?
Not yet, but that is the ultimate question. So all of the different types of work that we do at NASA, a lot of it is leading towards that ultimate answer. Is there life outside of Earth? And that life could be in the form of aliens, or it could be in the form of bacteria, which is what we really think we're likely to find if we're going to find life outside of this planet. We probably think it'll be in the form of that tiny, tiny little bacteria that you wouldn't necessarily see with your eyes, but you could put it under a microscope just like you would in a science lab and be able to see it there. So astronauts haven't seen it yet, and our scientists haven't seen it either yet, but they're continuing to try.
Natalie. Yeah.
They said they found a real alien ship and a guy touched it. Like, you don't know. And somebody touched it and they got
Okay. So is that a question or just a story? Okay. So let's do a couple of questions. Ella.
So, like, have there ever been, like, really bad problems in the spaceship? Like
So what are the problems?
There's
So what are like some of the problems that might cause the red light at mission control?
I've never gotten this question. So, and it's one of the more exciting things I've ever done. So different things that could cause the red lights in mission control. I'll give you an example that I actually had. So we have a communication system, and it's how astronauts can talk to us here on Earth and how we can talk to them. And in that communication system are multiple boxes. And one day, one of the boxes, it was an audio box, failed. And we don't know why, but we ended up getting a red symbol on our computer monitors that said we no longer could talk to the astronauts. Now, we do have redundancy, so we don't have just one line that we can talk to the astronauts. At the time, we only had 2 lines, but now we have 4 because we've upgraded it. So at the time, we only had 2, so we knew that our second channel was okay according to our data, but our first channel had failed, and I had gotten that red light that told me that. So when something like that happens, we tell the flight director, we have a failure. It looks like the audio channel isn't working anymore. And then they'll go up to the astronauts and try to do a test on that channel. Obviously, we wouldn't get a response back because I knew my data was showing it wasn't working. And then we'll go to the backup channel and let them know that that first channel isn't working, and we'll get it fixed as soon as we can. And then we have to do all our troubleshooting and get it fixed. So that's one example. Another example could be there's an environmental system on the International Space Station. It's how we keep the space station comfortable. Or a rocket would have the same thing if humans are on board. It's how we keep it comfortable. It's how we make sure when we breathe out, we breathe out carbon dioxide. Well, if you get too much carbon dioxide in the air, then you won't have enough oxygen, and that's what we have to breathe in to live. So we have things that will take the carbon dioxide outside, take it that's building up inside the space station, and then remove it from the air so that the oxygen level stays appropriate. Or air conditioners, so they don't get too hot and not too cold either. And so if one of those boxes fails, let's say there's too much carbon dioxide, which has happened before, because the filter needs to be changed or is broken, we'll get a red light on our data, and then we'll tell them the filter carbon dioxide levels are too high, and then we'll start trying to fix it. So those are a couple examples.
Good question. Ruby.
Have you ever been in a spaceship?
Have you ever been in a spaceship?
Have I ever sat inside one? Yes, it was so exciting. And if you ever get to go, let's see, we have a few different ones now that are no longer flying that you can actually sit in as well as a visitor. So if you're ever in Houston, there's one there. In Kennedy Space Center in Florida, there's one there as well. And you can see the real shuttles now. You can't sit in them, but you can see them, and they're at different areas in the U.S. as well. One is in Washington, D.C., one is in New York, one is in L.A., and one is in Florida.
Well, Grace, what's your question?
What is your favorite part of being an astronaut?
So the favorite part of her job?
Yeah.
Okay. Grace wants to know what's your favorite part of your job?
The favorite part of my job is probably the people. I really like the people I'm working with. And I think the main reason is we love what we do. Most of us really believe in exploration. We believe in science and answering questions. And so we often can relate to each other because we enjoy what we do. And I think it makes it a lot of fun. But I'd say my second favorite thing is being able to talk to people like you. I love the questions that you ask. I love being able to interact with you. I love seeing your enthusiasm for science and exploration and just the curiosity you have. That makes my job a lot of fun.
Is there another planet besides Earth that you can live on?
Not that we know of. So we know the most similar planet to Earth, but not exactly like it in our solar system is likely Mars. And that's why we continue to send rovers to Mars to learn more about it. And that's why the goal is to eventually send a person to Mars, because we think of all the planets in our solar system, it's the most habitable. Wow, I can never say that word. It's the most likely to be inhabited. That's the word I'm thinking of. But other than that, the other planets like Earth 2.0 that you've heard about, and the other ones that Kepler has found, they're too far away for us from Earth to get to. We wouldn't get there. I mean, it would just take way, way too long. Just to get to Mars takes no less than, right now, about 9 months. We think we could do it in 6 months with humans on board, but even 6 months is a long time for the human body to be out in space.
Charlotte, where do you live now?
I live in Washington, D.C. now. So in the D.C. area, we have 2 NASA centers. One is a big science center, that's Goddard Space Flight Center, and then one is headquarters where we manage the rest of NASA, which has 10 different centers total across the nation.
Michaela. I told you had your hands up. All right, we'll do Michaela in the front first. Can the astronauts breathe inside the rocket ships without their helmet?
Ooh, yes, they can. And the reason is that environmental system I told you about before. So if we didn't have the environmental system, they would have to have a helmet because they wouldn't have the oxygen. And the reason that the helmet allows you to get oxygen is that whole suit, when they're out in space and they have the helmet, they're hooked to an oxygen tank that you can't see. It's usually in the back, and it's covered up by a whole lot of fabric. So you would have to have not just the helmet, but also an oxygen tank that is sending oxygen through the tubes into your helmet so you can breathe it. But luckily in the rocket ships, we have this environmental system, and so they can be more comfortable inside the space station or the rocket ship because we have an oxygen system, kind of like you would have an air conditioner in your home. You don't really see it. It may even be outside your home, but you have all the systems that you need inside your house to be comfortable. So we kind of build the rocket ship similar to that.
Okay, other Michaela. Yeah. What's your question? Mackenzie. Why did I call you Michaela? It's Friday. I'm sorry. Mackenzie.
Where did they come up with flying saucers for aliens?
Where do they come up with flying saucers for aliens? Okay. Where do they come up with flying saucers for aliens?
I think you've asked the first question I can't answer. I honestly don't know where they came up with flying saucers. I really don't know.
Good question. Hayden?
When you are in a red light, has there ever been a time where you can figure it out?
So at Mission Control, when you've had a red light problem, has there ever been a time where you couldn't fix the problem?
Not yet, but some of the problems have taken us longer than we anticipated. And that does happen, and we'll often get asked, let's say the call sign. Everybody in Mission Control has a call sign for the position you're working. So for communication, it's called Cronus. And so flight director will say, Cronus has it coming on the troubleshooting, and we'll have to go back and say it's a little bit harder than we thought. We're not there yet. We estimate half an hour or 30 or 2 hours or whatever we think it'll be. But sometimes the failures are just so big. The thing with the space station in particular, but most rockets, is everything depends on each other. So if we lose a computer, for instance, then the computer is what regulates or allows all of the data to come to our systems here on Earth. So if we lose a computer out in space, then all of the other systems are affected now. And they don't know if they're healthy because the computer's broken. So we get a lot of these problems sometimes that are much more detailed than we anticipate. And so they'll take longer, but we have a time where we can't fix things that are critical. We have had times where boxes are just broken and we couldn't fix it, but we could replace it. So I guess the answer to your question is actually yes. There are times when we couldn't fix something, replace it.
Okay, Tessa.
I heard that there's a new space shuttle that can fly through space and look through space for new planets. And my dad said it was called TESS.
So is it true that there is a new, it's like a shuttle? A new space shuttle that flies through space looking for planets, and it's called a TESS? Is that true?
What was the name that she thought it was?
TESS.
TESS. So I think what you might be thinking of is not a rocket flying through space looking for planets. Is that what she said, looking for planets?
Yeah.
It's not a rocket necessarily. I mean, you could think of it as a rocket, but it's more, we call it a spacecraft. And it's called, the one that is currently looking for planets and has found the most number of planets is called Kepler. And that's the one that found Earth 2.0 that was in the news recently, the planet that we think is most like Earth. And Kepler has found many, many other planets as well, too. But we call it a spacecraft rather than a rocket.
Yeah.
Can astronauts bring back aliens from a planet?
I think we've discovered that we haven't found aliens yet.
Yeah, but there could be living things. But if there is, not just.
So if astronauts were to find if and when they find living organisms, would they be able to bring them back to Earth?
I asked it.
That's an interesting question. I don't think we know yet. I think it'll depend what the form is of the life that we find, if we were to ever find it on another planet, and the safety measures that we could take to bring it back to Earth safely. And the reason I say that is we won't know how that organism, let's say it is bacteria, we won't know how that organism will affect us here on Earth. And so one thing that we have to manage is the safety of people on Earth, of humans on Earth, is top priority. It is completely over science. So our safety comes first. And we wouldn't want to bring anything here if we don't know what it could do to the health and safety of humans. So I think when that time comes closer, we're already talking about this, they would have to come up with very fancy ways of making sure, if we were to bring them back, that we had ways to contain it and that it couldn't get out. So those are questions that are unanswered right now. I don't think anybody really knows, but people are probably talking about it.
Good question. Have any astronauts ever died?
So we haven't had any astronauts who have died in space. We have had astronauts who have died in 3 different accidents in our history in the U.S. There have been some in the Russian space program as well, but not in space. Thus far in space, we've been able to keep them alive and healthy, and they've done the science and the engineering they need to do, and we've brought them back. The 3 accidents that happened, one was in the Apollo days, and that's the program that sent astronauts to the moon. And the very first Apollo capsule was being tested. And at that time, the engineers who had built it had made it a pure oxygen environment. Came about while the astronauts were inside. And the spark caused a fire in the Apollo capsule. And the door, for some reason, was designed such that it took an incredible amount of force to open. And these astronauts were known to be very, very strong, fit military test pilot men, and they couldn't get the door open, and so they perished inside the Apollo test chamber, and that was an incredibly difficult accident in the 60s. In the 80s, 1980s, when I was a little girl, I was very young. I was probably younger than you are. We had the Challenger accident, and we had 7 astronauts who were launching in space, and there was a problem with the booster, which is the 2 side rockets that you used to see if you've ever seen a picture of the space shuttle. And one of them didn't seal properly because the booster is made of multiple parts, and they have to seal properly. And so at liftoff, there was a leak, and that caused the entire rocket to blow up, and all 7 astronauts were lost there. And then in the 2000 accident, and that was on landing. So on re-entry, it's a big fireball. When you're coming in, how many of you have learned about friction? Good. So a lot of you. So when you know friction makes things hot, it creates heat. And so when the shuttle is coming into the atmosphere, its nose is pointed down like this, and it's coming in, and the air is moving against it because it's coming in, and the air is moving like this, and it creates a lot of frictional heat at the nose and across the entire space shuttle. And so what happened, and we didn't know about it at that time, was we knew there was a big hole, but we didn't realize how big or how detrimental it was going to be. Our engineers had thought that it was safe to come back, and that's why we let the astronauts come back. There was a hole in the wing because of something that hit it on launch, and that left a lot of the lines underneath it exposed. And so when the frictional heat made contact with the parts that were supposed to be protected, but there was a hole now, that caused the entire space shuttle to break up. And so we lost those astronauts as well.
Lori.
What's the name of the other?
Is there a name yet for the new planet that was discovered?
There is a name, and I don't remember it. Those planets are named with a letter and like 4 numbers usually, or something like that. So I never can remember it. And I think most popularly, it's being called Earth 2.0.
Arabelle.
Well, like if they found an alien and it was safe to bring it back, could the alien die on Earth?
So if they were to find an alien and they brought it back, would it be able to live on Earth or would it die on Earth?
We don't know, right? Because we don't know how any of those aliens or other life forms would live in a new planet, just like we don't know how we would live on a different planet. Most likely adapted to its own planet and its own mix of air and oxygen and elements. And so its environment would be totally different here. But the real answer is we have no idea.
Yeah. Have the spaceships ever been used as kind of like airplanes, just trying to get to different places on Earth?
Not yet. It would be really expensive to use them for that purpose. And a lot of them aren't capable because they're meant to be launched vertically, and to get around Earth, you'd have to move horizontally like a plane. They're built very different and don't have necessarily the capability to be able to fly in the other direction, if you will. And you probably wouldn't want to do it because it would be too expensive. It's easier to use a plane.
My teacher told us about the explosion with a teacher on board. So I thought it was like a volunteer thing and a teacher on board, but there was like a news board on the track and they went up and exploded.
Yeah, that was in the Challenger. Yeah. Grace, what's your question?
Does sometimes when you wear the helmet, it sound like you're Darth Vader?
When astronauts wear the helmet, do they sound like Darth Vader sometimes?
No, they sound like themselves. So we do get to hear them whenever they go out into space to do a spacewalk. We have a communications box that allows us to be able to hear them the entire time that they're out there. So sometimes they're speaking to each other and sometimes they're speaking to us in mission control to give them assistance. A lot of times they're just speaking to each other, but they sound like their normal selves.
In space, in the space shuttle,
What type of food do they have to eat when they're in the space shuttle?
Oh, so food has come a long way from early spaceflight travel. We didn't know as much about food today. So they can often eat almost anything that they want. Now, it doesn't always taste the same as it would if you were to be here on Earth. So some of the things astronauts have told me personally, there's no piping hot meal. You know, when you might get home and your mom or your dad has this awesome dinner made and it just came out of the oven and it's really hot. Sometimes it even burns your mouth. That kind of heating capability isn't available in space. So most of the meals that they have are lukewarm, maybe room temperature. But they can often get whatever they want. So if you like mac and cheese, you can have mac and cheese. And the way they do it is we freeze dry the food. That means we remove all of the water. And the reason we do that is it extends the shelf life without adding a bunch of chemicals to it. So you remove all the water, and so it's dried, and you put it in a packet, suck out all of the air as well, and then it's really compact. So you can fly the macaroni and cheese, so it's got like cheese powder and the cooked macaroni in a packet, and then when they get up into space, they say, you know, they want to eat macaroni and cheese for dinner, they take the packet out, and they can add water to it and reconstitute it, mix it together, and they have their macaroni and cheese. So oftentimes the astronauts, right before they go up into the space station, they work with our food labs at Johnson Space Center, and they can make requests. So for instance, we had an astronaut whose half Indian, of Indian descent from her father's from India, and so she really likes the dish called palak paneer, which is spinach and Indian cheese cubes. And so the food labs actually figured out how to make palak paneer so she could have it when she was in space to give her a little piece. They also have all sorts of snacks. You may have seen videos of the astronauts eating M&Ms. They love throwing them in the air and they float and then they chomp them like that. That's one of their favorite things to do. If you've never seen that video, I'll send it to your teacher so she can show it to you. It's really funny. But all sorts of dry snacks they can have. Peanuts, almonds, pecans, things like that.
So in the astronaut suit, you know how they breathe in oxygen, but when they breathe out the carbon dioxide, where does it go?
When the astronauts breathe in oxygen, where does the carbon dioxide go in the helmet?
It goes out into, yeah, so it'll go out into the air or into their helmet, and then we have filters that'll scrub out the, we call it scrubbing out the carbon dioxide. So it'll actually take the carbon dioxide, scrub it out of the air, and then put it into the box that's been designed to get rid of it.
Anya. Like, well, while they're in space or outside?
Both.
Okay. So do you get to personally talk to the astronauts while they're in space and also on the ground?
Good question. So on the ground, yes, especially when we're training them. We're working directly one-on-one. If they have questions, they ask us, and we get back to them. Training time set aside just for that one-on-one training. And then we also have training set aside for one on the entire team. So I would have the entire astronaut team, all 7 of them, or all 3 of them, depending how big the mission is or where they're going. Space station is usually a team of 3. Space shuttle was a team of 7. So whatever that vehicle team size is. And so sometimes there's team training, sometimes there's individual training as well. When they're in space, however, we only allow one person to talk to them, and that's called the Capcom. It comes from the old space days when there was capsules that flew in space, and so Capcom stands for Capsule Communicator. And in those days, you had to be an astronaut in order to talk to the astronauts. So if you weren't an astronaut, you couldn't be Capcom. Today, it's a little bit more liberal, but the people who become Capcoms is a very limited number. It's a very difficult position to get. So with mission control, I can't talk to the astronauts directly. I talk to the flight director. The flight director tells the Capcom what to say to the astronauts. Oftentimes, that Capcom is an astronaut, though.
Julie.
Do they have like a room with fans at the bottom of it?
Okay, so when the astronauts train, do they have like a room that has like a bunch of fans that I guess feels like they're floating up in space?
So there isn't really any room like that, but where they get their feeling of weightlessness before they go into space to help them train for that feeling is actually in a big pool. It's called the NBL, or the Neutral Buoyancy Lab. And what they do is go scuba diving. So has anyone gone snorkeling in the ocean? Yeah, so for those who have gone snorkeling, you'll know like what you do is put on that mask, and so you can and it covers your nose so you can actually breathe when you're looking down into the water. And so the next thing from snorkeling is to go scuba diving, and that's when you actually put a helmet on and put an oxygen tank on and actually sink down into the ocean 20, 30, 40 feet, 50 feet, sometimes 100 feet, depending. The deeper you go, the more dangerous it is. But you learn how to do that when you're a scuba diver. And so astronauts become scuba dive certified, and then they dive into a pool that's about 40 feet deep. And then we make them what's called neutrally buoyant. That means that they weigh just enough. We put weights on them so they sink, but then take some of the weights out, but keep some on them so they stay in the water. They don't float all the way to the top, but they don't also sink to the bottom. Does that make sense? And that way they get this feeling of floating. It's almost like they're floating in the water. So they have enough weight on them that they don't float to the top, but not so much weight that they sink to the bottom. And they're just kind of in the middle of the pool. And then they can practice that feeling of being weightless.
So I'm going to take the hands of people who haven't asked a question yet, okay? Let's see, Vivian. Okay. Is time different in space?
So time isn't technically different in space. space, but there are no time zones in space. So it's kind of difficult to answer that question. But I can tell you how we handle it. Because there is no defined time zone in space, what we do is go off of GMT, and that's Greenwich Mean Time, where the international date line is over on the other side of the world, in Greenwich, England. That's where the Greenwich Mean Time comes from. So we do everything off of Greenwich Mean Time, and the reason we do that, it's called GMT, is the entire world understands GMT. Everybody who's in the science and technical disciplines, if you tell them at 1200 GMT, they know what that means. They just understand it. They're used to that timekeeping system. We'll use GMT to describe things that happen. And remember, we're not the only ones who explore space. Space is being explored by many different countries around the world. And that's why it's important to be able to speak a language that everybody can understand. Now, for our astronauts in space, our U.S. astronauts, we do also keep them on the central time zone, which is where mission control is, in terms of wake up and sleep times. And so their work days match our work days. And so we'll wake them up when we're in mission control. We'll give them the time to sleep per our Houston time. But everything we describe, all the events that we do, public affairs events, things like that, we run that off of GMT.
Maya.
Do they go to have
When they're floating around in space, is it like they're swimming? Is it like the same feeling?
So a lot of them will actually come back and tell us that the training they got in the pool when they were neutrally buoyant, or swimming, if you will, was really good training for the feeling you got. But it wasn't exactly the same. There is no good substitute for actually floating, the real floating experience that you have in space. That's what the astronauts have told us, at least. But the pool was a very good simulation of it.
Okay. Anybody else who didn't raise their hand? Really?
Have you ever been on the astronaut equipment?
Have you ever been on the astronaut training equipment? Have you tried that out before?
I have. Oh, it's so much fun. A lot of it's a lot of fun. Some of it's computers. So a lot of the material they have to learn is just like going to school like you do. And they have to memorize things, they have to learn things, they have to ask the questions. And then a lot of it are actual trainers, actual hands-on things. And yes, in order to be able to train the astronauts, we have to go through a certification period, and we have to use all of that same equipment before we can train them.
How do you drink things in space?
Could you say one more time?
How do you drink in space?
How do you drink in space?
Yes.
So they often use straws to drink in space, unless they're being goofy and they're playing around. Sometimes they'll put because everything floats in space and water acts a little bit differently in space than it does here on Earth because of surface tension. And so sometimes they'll use their straw and put a little bit of water droplet out in space, and then they'll chomp it like that M&M. But most typically they drink through a straw.
Have you ever put on a spacesuit before?
I have. So that's, I never thought I was going to get that chance. And all the time I spend in Houston, where all the astronauts are, I never got to put on a suit. But I did when I got to D.C. And we actually have a suit at one of our NASA centers here. And I was able to put it on, including the gloves. And let me tell you, you feel really big. I mean, the suit's really heavy on Earth. Now in space, it doesn't matter, remember, because you don't have that feeling of gravity weighing down on you. So the weight doesn't really matter, but on Earth, it is really heavy.
Lila. Is there a limited number of times an astronaut can go up into space?
Not on paper. There's no actual hard limit that we put the astronauts on. They are often limited by other factors, like the number of people who are waiting to fly, for instance. They could get assigned to a space flight because of prior experience. Maybe the astronaut has the very best skills that are needed for this mission, so then they might get chosen for that one, and the other astronauts may not get chosen because they needed a very specific skill set. So selecting the astronauts to go on missions, there's a whole team that does that, but there's no hard limit on the number of times you can go into space. The only hard limit, and I don't remember what it is is how much radiation a person can be exposed to. And astronauts are exposed to radiation out in space because what protects us from the radiation coming from the sun is our atmosphere. And you don't have that when you're out in space. So we do have spacewalk, but it's not as effective as our atmosphere. And so every astronaut has to have a little button that calculates how much radiation they're exposed to. And so there is a limit on that. So if they hit that limit, then they wouldn't be able to fly into space again. So I guess that would be one way that could keep them from flying. But as of now, no astronaut has ever come close to the limit on the radiation.
All right, so we're going to do 2 more. So Fiona.
How much do you think spacesuits have evolved and changed since the beginning of their invention?
How much have spacesuits evolved?
They've evolved. Well, so in practice, they have not evolved. They've evolved from the early days when Alan Shepard, who was the first American in space, from to the Gemini, which is probably the suit that is most like the one we use today. So they have evolved, but I wouldn't say they've evolved a lot. The suits that we have in testing, those have evolved quite a bit, and we may get to see those for long-term space travel. So the ones we're using on the International Space Station are very much so like the ones we used on the Space Shuttle, if not exactly the same. And the Space Shuttle is very similar to the programs before it. But the ones for the next program have a huge possibility of being thinner and lighter. So a lot of research is being put into what we call advanced suits. Does anybody remember when the guy named Felix jumped out of a plane? Do you remember this? Fearless Felix, that's what they called him. Fearless Felix. Okay, so maybe your teacher can look up this video. He was a brave man, and we did work with him. He created his own suit, and it looks nothing like the space suit that the astronauts wear, but it was still a pressurized suit. And he went up to the upper parts of the atmosphere where you were almost in outer space. And he jumped out of the plane without a spaceship around him. And we learned a lot from that suit that he had. And that suit looks very different. So that we're taking a lot of that research from that suit, in addition to the research our suit engineers have already been doing.
All right, so we're going to do our last question. Why is gravity different in space than it is on Earth?
So gravity is not different in space than it is on Earth. It's the way we feel the gravity. So in order for a spaceship, gravity exists in space as well. And it's kind of a confusing concept, but let me see if I can explain it to you. In order for a spaceship, so a spaceship has to launch from Earth, goes through our atmosphere, and it gets into space. And then, as you know, it circles around the Earth in what we call an orbit. Well, if it wasn't for gravity, that spaceship would just float away. It would never actually make this orbit. So what it's actually doing is called free fall. How many of you have ever been on a roller coaster? Okay, so if you've ever been on a roller coaster, you have actually felt free falling. Do you remember you go climb, 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 you get to the top of the hill, and as soon as you go down, you know that feeling in your stomach like something just fell out of it? That feeling, that very quick feeling on the way down is called free falling. And so a spaceship in space is constantly free falling around the Earth. And for that split second, you actually didn't feel gravity. It was around you, but you didn't feel it because you were falling at just the right speed and the right acceleration, the acceleration due to gravity, so that you didn't feel gravity. It canceled each other out. And so that's what's happening with the spaceship. It is constantly free falling at the right speed, which is 17,500 miles per hour out in space, so that it continues to go around the Earth, but it doesn't actually feel the gravity because it's accelerated at the speed of gravity, and it's falling at that right speed where it continues to go around the Earth, but the effects of gravity are neglected, or they're negligible.
Cool.
I know it's a really technical concept.
Yeah. All right. Well, Mamta, thank you so much. We learned so much, right?
Yeah. I thought your questions were awesome. I love having these conversations.
Thank you.
Enjoy the camp.
Thanks. So we're actually, for the rest of the day, we're gonna experiment with our own centers of gravity, and then we're gonna go outside today, and we're gonna set off some bottle rockets and do our own rockets too. So our whole day is around space. So this was really great.
Awesome, good. I hope you girls enjoy looking through the telescope too. Have fun.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.